Test, test. All right. Hello, everybody. It is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our Headwaters Science Center afternoon STEM shows. And of course, I'm in my office here, and I have the fireplace going behind me, which means that we are going to be doing another React video here. And so today I have a video that's covering a topic that I talked about in one of the kind of standard shows maybe 2 weeks ago now, where I talked about an event called the Great Dying, which is this big extinction event that happens, like, basically last thing that happens before kind of the age of the dinosaurs. So we talked a little bit about kind of what the world looked like before the dinosaurs, what were some of the things that caused this big extinction event to happen. We looked at some fossils that were of that era. But I was perusing YouTube of my channels that I look at when I'm looking for videos to react to here. I found a PBS Eons video about it, which I've done a couple PBS Eons videos with this before. It's been a while. The last one I think I did was talking about, it was the Great Snake Debate. It was talking about what's the origin of snakes, why don't they have any legs, when did that start, and why did that start? Which that was a good video. I had found that very interesting, actually, and hopefully this will be the same. And so, yeah, like I said, this is a PBS Eons video. It's called, is it From the Cambrian Explosion to the Great Dying? And before we get started here, just remind everybody that I'm here with the Headwaters Science Center. See it on my hat there. And the Headwaters Science Center is open 7 days a week. We are open from Monday through Friday from 9:30 to 5. And we are open on Sundays from 1 to 5, so after lunch on Sundays, basically. And then pretty much every day at 3:30, we do some sort of live stream here, and we go live concurrently across Twitch, across YouTube, and Facebook. So you can check us out on any of those, and then usually a video will go up on YouTube of all of the streams. So if you miss it while it's happening live, you can go back and check out our YouTube, youtube.com/Headwaters Science Center, and there'll be a VOD of it, a video on demand of it, that you can go and catch up. So, like I said, if you want to go back and watch the presentation I did about the Great Dying week and a half ago, or however long that was, you can go check that out, and then also watch this one there. And so I think we'll swap over here to this and this. We'll get started.
Thank you to Audible for supporting PBS Digital Studios. Let me tell you, there are no dull moments in the story of life. Sure, within the whole geologic time scale, there may be some episodes that are less exciting than others. But the first era of our current eon, the Paleozoic era, is probably the most deceptively fascinating time in Earth's history. I say deceptively because even though Paleozoic means ancient life, this span of time from 541 million to 252 million years ago doesn't have stuff like dinosaurs or saber-toothed cats.
Yeah, and looks like she's about to go into it here, but one of the things I really like about this era is there is such a unique diversification of life. It's like pre-mammal, it's, you know, mostly pre-mammal, mostly pre-reptile, but there is this huge diversification of invertebrates that happens this time. With the thing they're presumably going to talk about a little bit in this is the Cambrian explosion, where you have this very sudden, very broad diversification of invertebrates that happens within a relatively short amount of time here, where this is when echinoderms, things like starfish, become things. This is when arthropods, things like insects and crabs, become things. I think cephalopods are in here too, things like octopi and squids. Other mollusks like snails become things during this time too. So it all happens, like I said, within a couple 100 million years, which honestly, we haven't really seen that level of diversification happening in that short of amount of time since. And I said, ultimately what we'll see here is it culminates in a giant extinction event that ends up wiping out most of it.
So it's often overlooked as a time of primitive and boring creatures. But the fact is, the Paleozoic era was truly a make-it-or-break-it time for life on Earth. At the beginning of the Paleozoic, living things were extremely simple and not very dynamic. Life was fragile, vulnerable. But the Paleozoic was also easily the most chaotic of all three eras of our eon, with near-constant revolutions in life punctuated by catastrophic extinctions. In fact, by the end of this era, our planet was the closest closest it's ever gotten to being devoid of life altogether. It's the
I don't know if I fully agree with this. This is as far as, like, the number of species that go extinct at the end of this. It's the biggest, like, as far as how many things go away. So it's true on that end, but there is a previous major extinction event that I've talked about on a couple of occasions with these, and I think PBS Eons actually has a video about this too. Maybe we can check that one out too here, called the Great Oxidation Event, where it's basically when photosynthetic plants and algae become a thing, and the entire chemistry of Earth's atmosphere and oceans ends up changing because of that, because all of a sudden you have all these things that are taking in CO2 and creating oxygen as a waste product. So you see a relatively sudden dip in relative CO2 levels in the atmosphere and a big spike in oxygen. And so most life on Earth at that point was didn't use oxygen. It was all methane, basically, is what stuff was using, kind of in the same way that life now uses oxygen. And so because you had this very sudden spike in the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, wiped out something like 90+% of all life on Earth died out over the course of this big extinction event that happened, not, so it's probably 250 million years ago is when the one she's talking about happens, and this one happened like almost 1 billion years ago. So it's I guess a debatable topic in that there's probably more different types of species that got wiped out in the Great Dying, but as like a relative percentage of all life on Earth, the Great Oxidation Event is probably the closer event as far as wiping out all life on Earth.
Closest that life ever got to just failing. So, far from dull, the Paleozoic era just might be one of the most harrowing chapters in the story of life on Earth. For the first 3.5 billion years or so that life existed on this planet, things were simple. Almost all living things were in the oceans, and most of them couldn't move on their own. So the big, complex ecosystems that we know today, with active predators and mobile prey, didn't really exist. Pretty much whatever drifted by you was what you ate. That is, until about 541 million years ago, when the Paleozoic era began with a period known as the Cambrian. And right from the start, things were dramatic. This burst of evolutionary innovation, which you know as the Cambrian explosion, was likely the result of a whole bunch of environmental triggers. In the early Cambrian, thanks to a boom among phytoplankton in the oceans, oxygen levels suddenly ramped up, allowing life to flourish. Meanwhile, changes in the chemistry of the oceans brought on by erosion allowed animals to develop things like shells and exoskeletons, and this led to the formation of new body plans that the world had never seen before. Almost every major group of animals that exist today developed within the first 40 million years of the Cambrian, along with many game-changing adaptations like calcified hard parts, flexible limbs, and the very first eyes. For instance, the first large predatory organisms appeared, like Anomalocaris, which hunted worms and other soft-bodied creatures. And over time, some animals like arthropods developed hard exoskeletons to protect themselves. But others like Pacaya and Haikuela went in a different direction. They developed the ability to swim under their own power with a flexible rod of cartilage to power their tail. These ancient swimmers would become the ancestors of the vertebrates. Major breakthroughs like these resulted in whole new fantastic ecosystems with complex food webs that life had not experienced before. But this explosion of life couldn't last forever. The Cambrian ended 488 million years ago in a mysterious mass extinction that saw the disappearance of many trilobite and mollusk species. While this extinction is not well understood, a sudden crash in oxygen levels may have been to blame. And remember that, because a lot of the pivotal events in the Paleozoic will hinge on the amount of oxygen, either in the oceans or in the atmosphere. But the next period, the Ordovician, bounced back with another burst in diversity. This one's known as the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBE. You can think of the GOBE as kind of the sequel to the Cambrian explosion, a sequel that was every bit as impressive as the original. Like the Cambrian event, the GOBE was brought on by a host of changes in the environment. For one thing, a burst of geological activity about 470 million years ago meant that the continents were on the move, creating new chains of islands, and with them new isolated habitats.
And what she's talking about here is she mentions, another extinction event that happens, 400 and some million years ago, where a bunch of species get wiped out. And this is like a pretty common cycle that we see over the course of the fossil record, where we get kind of an explosion of diversity that happens, followed up by a pretty major extinction event relatively shortly thereafter. And more often than not, it's brought up by some major environmental change. So you get an environmental change, it kills off a bunch of the previous stuff that was adapted for the previous environment, and then over the course of the next several million years, you get diversification that happens to be adapted to what the current state of things is, and then you get another big environmental change event that happens. It wipes out a bunch of stuff again, and it kind of resets. And the stuff that you tend to see that survives these things, the stuff that keeps going and becomes kind of the basis of the next batch of diversification, tends to be very like generalist things. And so you tend to see stuff that is the stuff that if you want to look for animals that are like the very most highly specialized things for their environment, look for stuff right before major extinction events, because that's stuff that is really had more time to evolve to fit this like really hyper specific niche. And then, like I said, that's the stuff that when any type of change happens is going to be in the worst position to continue existing going forward. One animal I talked about with this not super long ago, don't remember what show that was, but we talked about saber-toothed cats, for example, where they're cool and interesting as like this big heavy-bodied cat, but they have this really hyper-specific adaptation of this big long tooth that is really only useful for hunting these giant mammals that have these really big, thick, heavy coats. Like, it's an adaptation that exists specifically for that. So once you start seeing, these big, heavy mammals go away as the world starts warming up at the end of the last glacial period, all of a sudden the saber-toothed cats are in a position where it's like, well, my saber tooth is not particularly any more valuable anymore than just like a normal cat canine would be. And on top of that, it's like more fragile, it's more apt to break and cause me problems. So I guess I just go extinct now because I'm just worse than a regular cat in the absence of like the hyper specific context that made this tooth worth having.
And this, combined with changes in sea level and another boost of oxygen in the oceans, stimulated a lot of rapid change. For example, this is when the first true fish appear on the scene, ostracoderms, which were jawless and covered in bony plates. Meanwhile, cephalopods reached new lengths, like the shelled giant Camarasaurus, which grew up to 6 meters long. But while all this was going on in the water, things on land were truly revolutionary. Before the Ordovician, terrestrial life was probably limited to microbes, but early in the GOBE, the very first land plants sprouted in the primordial rocks. Based on their fossilized spores, we know these plants were small, like modern mosses, and if anything, this early greenery might have been too successful. The massive number of plants on land took in so much carbon dioxide that the Earth's temperature plummeted, and boom, ice age. This cold snap occurred 444 million years ago, just as marine oxygen levels started to drop, and this combination caused the most devastating mass extinction that animal life had faced so far. The Ordovician-SILURIan extinction event wiped out 86% of marine species, including many kinds of trilobites and cephalopods. As you can tell from the name, it brought an end to the Ordovician and marked the beginning of the next period, the Silurian. Life was able to recover once again in the Silurian, this time as the climate gradually warmed. Plants, for example, started to spread over the land. Fossils of early vascular plants like Cooksonia first appear in rocks from this period, as do the first fossils of terrestrial fungi. The jawless ostracoderms were still the most common swimmers in the sea, and they developed all sorts of spines and horns, likely to protect themselves from carnivorous sea scorpions, the eurypterids.
What is ostracoderm? Ostracoderm. Shell skins. Okay. Say, because the kind of marquee fish from this era are the placoderms, which is like also the I think placo is like plate or hard or armor or something like that. So you have like the armor skins and then also the shell skins is plate skinned.
But by the end of the Silurian 419 million years ago, a new type of fish learned to bite back. Jawed fish like Entelognathus appeared in the seas, equipped with biting power that allowed them to tackle prey that the jawless fish couldn't handle. And the Silurian drew to a close with its own relatively minor series of extinction events, likely brought about by the drops in sea level that caused many bottom-dwelling species, particularly cephalopods, to die out. The period that
one of the things that she touched on kind of, but hasn't really gone in depth on, and maybe she will yet. She's been talking about relative oxygen levels in the ocean. And one of the things that was interesting, and I might need to go back and read up on a little bit more again, is she was talking about how there was a cooling event that happened that coincided with a bunch of O2 levels lowering in the ocean, which is not what you would expect. Like, cold water is better at holding oxygen than warm water is. So I wonder what the impetus was for the O2 levels in the oceans lowering at that time. I don't remember her mentioning that, but maybe I'll go back and rewatch that. Because yeah, usually when you see cooling events happen, like I said, the associated thing you would expect is that, like I said, there would be more oxygen in the water rather than oxygen plummeting in association with a cooling event. So there must have been something else going on there. You see that even on like a season to season basis around here, where there's measurably more oxygen in the water around here in the winter than there is in the summer.
Followed the Devonian was when fish began their takeover of the seas. During this time, the earliest sharks make their appearance, but the true kings of the Devonian were another kind of fish, the placoderms. The largest of these jawed, armored fish filled the niches we associate with whales and sharks today, including filter feeders like Titanichthys and the apex predators like Dunkleosteus. While the placoderms were conquering the seas, things were getting even more crowded.
Yeah, and Dunkleosteus is like the fish you associate, at least me, the fish I associate with kind of the pre-dinosaur era. That's there's a very specific Dunkleosteus head. Dunkleosteus. That is a common, a fossil that you see often replicated in a lot of museums and the like you'll see there is, I don't know where the actual like real fossil is of that one, but that's one of those fossils where, like, if you're in the museum sector, you've seen casts of this fossil 100 times at 100 different museums. The Dunkleosteus one. Great Lakes Aquarium in Duluth has one of them.
On land, arthropods really started to diversify, with the first insects and terrestrial arachnids emerging. Trees also arose at this time, forming a canopy above the arthropods, and these Devonian forests became the first major terrestrial ecosystems on Earth. Meanwhile, back at the water's edge, relatives of lobe-finned fish had adapted to spend more time in the shallows, pulling themselves along muddy shorelines. Then, 397 million years ago, descendants of these critters finally hauled themselves on land for the first time. No skeletons of these ancient pioneers are known, but footprints in Poland show evidence of these very first tetrapods, animals with 4 limbs. By the late Devonian 365 million years ago, tetrapods had made their way across the entire globe, from Acanthostega in Greenland to this dude in Russia. So the Devonian produced the first complex land ecosystems while also seeing vertebrates take center stage in the oceans for the first time. But the period ended in, you guessed it, another mass extinction. This one took place from 375 to 358 million years ago and came in at least 2 phases. Together, these events are known as the late Devonian extinctions, and they seem to have been caused by a series of drops in oxygen levels in the seas. By the end of the Devonian, many trilobites and all of the armored placoderms had vanished from the world's oceans. Luckily for us and other land animals, at least some early tetrapods survived into the next period, the Carboniferous. But
I've never really looked into like what the expectation is as far as like why the placoderms specifically die out. Like, what is the and maybe they just had higher oxygen needs than a lot of other stuff because they're big and active. But I've never actually like looked into that, like why the placoderms, which, like I said, are kind of the marquee vertebrate of the era, are placoderms, and they said fully disappear after a relatively short amount of time. But other fish keep going and surviving. So, like I said, I don't know why the placoderms get got so hard, but you know, the other ones don't.
These creatures lived in a very different world from the Devonian. This time, oxygen in the atmosphere ramped up, and this, along with a humid, warm climate, allowed dense forests and swamps to spread across the continents. All that oxygen was also a plus for the arthropods, which got huge in the Carboniferous. But the bigger news was a major change among the tetrapods. Previously, all tetrapods laid their eggs in water, but around 340 million years ago, a group of tetrapods called amniotes began laying their eggs with shells that protected them from drying out. And this turned out to be a crucial adaptation because it was around this time that the continents began to merge into a single supercontinent. Eventually, over millions of years, it would become Pangea.
Uh-oh, a big geologic event is happening. I wonder what's going to happen to all these new species that are diversifying.
This landmass was so big that it was impossible for moisture from the ocean to reach inland. The result? A severe drop in humidity and temperature that wiped out much of the Carboniferous forest about 305 million years ago. It's known today as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. By the end of this period, about 290 million years ago, much of the forests were replaced by a giant desert at the heart of the continent, with extensive glaciers in the southern hemisphere. These arid wastelands would have been uninhabitable for early tetrapods, but not for the amniotes, and they rapidly split into two major groups, the reptiles and the synapsids. And both groups spent the last period of the Paleozoic, the Permian, spreading across Pangea. The synapsids were actually stem mammals, and they were survivors, producing the first large terrestrial herbivores like Dimetrodon. But as the Permian went on, the climate...
Is Dimetrodon an herbivore? I've always assumed that Dimetrodons are carnivorous because I feel like they usually have sharp, pointy teeth. Gotta check that out quick. Did I catch him on a thing? Probably one of the apex predators feeding on fish and tetrapods, including, yeah. Said I don't think I've ever seen anything that implies that Dimetrodons were herbivores.
Pangea. The synapsids were actually stem mammals, and they were survivors, producing the first large terrestrial herbivores like Dimetrodon. Yeah. But as the Permian went on, the climate got hotter and drier. Stem mammals and reptiles alike were forced to adapt to even harsher conditions. On the reptile side, there were cattle-sized herbivores like pariosaurs. Meanwhile, stem mammals grew even stranger, with the saber-toothed gorgonopsids hunting hippo-like omnivores with weird head ornaments, like a Stymenosuchus. But this Permian safari park came to a terrifying end 252 million years ago. It was probably caused by a combination of volcanic activity and climate change, but the result, the Permian-Triassic extinction event, nearly spelled doom for life on Earth. 96% of marine species, including many sharks, fish, and all the trilobites, were wiped out. On land, the stem mammals and the reptiles suffered as well, with a 70% loss of terrestrial species. So it began with an explosion of life, but the Paleozoic ended in near apocalypse.
So 96% is a higher number that I've really ever heard for this. Like, most of the stuff I've seen on it puts it somewhere in the like 80s as far as the percentage of ocean life that got wiped out. Just a quick note on that, I guess. I don't really have anything to add beyond that, but that's a different number than what I've historically heard. But again, this is all stuff that I was taking in school 10 years ago, so this is probably newer information.
Apocalypse. And while life started out in this era as simple, small marine organisms, by its end, life had conquered the oceans, taken the very first steps on land, and spread to the most inhospitable corners of our planet. So yes, it was not exactly a heyday of charismatic megafauna, but it's no overstatement to say that the Paleozoic era made life what it is today. Thank you to Audible for supporting PBS Digital Studios.
Yeah, and as I think, and she talked about this too, obviously, is I think it is an underappreciated era because there's not a whole lot of like big terrestrial stuff going on. Like, I feel like as a kid, I remember being a fan of trilobites as a kid because we had some trilobite fossils like that. I don't know, my dad had found somewhere, and I remember being pretty pumped about trilobites and being excited because I was like, ooh, these are even older than dinosaurs. But like, again, my excitement around them was very much predicated on like very, very heavily tied to dinosaurs and being able to show off about this thing that I knew about that was older than dinosaurs, rather than necessarily being that interested in the trilobites themselves. And I think a lot of the pre-dinosaur stuff kind of gets that treatment. The dinosaurs are such a like dominant thing as far as people's interests in paleontology that I think a lot of the other honestly really weird, really interesting stuff that exists around them a lot of times gets kind of, like I said, underappreciated, understudied. Even though like this is an era that's pretty inarguably like more important to the diversification of life on Earth than the dinosaurs were, I would argue, because like I said, this is the era where pretty much all of the invertebrate classes that we have today become a thing. I said the end of this is when mammals become a thing. You know, it's, I don't know, another perception I remember having as a kid is that mammals were much more recent thing than reptiles were. Like, I feel like when you're learning biology, you kind of see it as, I'm gonna swap over to other screen here. Like you learn it as like kind of a hierarchy where it's like, yeah, you have your sponges and your cnidarians and you know all your other invertebrate classes. And then you get into the vertebrates, and then you know you learn it as this hierarchy of like fish and then amphibians and then reptiles and then birds and then mammals. And because we're mammals, we put mammals at the end of that, you know, to imply that we're the kind of current apex of what exists on this planet, even though birds are more recent than we are. Like substantially more recent than what mammals are. And even, you know, reptiles, I remember like as I was getting into like college basically is when I, you know, first kind of encountered the idea of like, oh, reptiles aren't even really like ancestral to mammals. Like we're not descended from reptiles. We split apart before reptiles were even like really a thing. The whole synapsids thing, is it a reptile, is it a mammal, is it a mammal like reptile, is it a reptile like mammal, is it an entire thing on its own, is a whole deal that like honestly I've never even really tried to keep up with like what the literature, what the current perception is within that, because it seems like it changes a lot what sort of the idea is surrounding that. But it is something that, like I said, conceptually is very interesting because, like I said, it clashes so much with kind of what the way this stuff is taught at like the middle and high school level, where it's like, yeah, mammals, we're the current kind of runners of the world. We're the ones who are the most successful vertebrate class right now. We're pretty inarguably the thing that's having the biggest impact on the global ecosystem right now. It's the age of mammals at the moment, and that must mean that, you know, we sit at the top of the pyramid, and implied in that, along with, you know, evolutionary ideologies, that we're the most recent, we're the most advanced. But like I said, it doesn't really play that way. And so just going back to like a topic that I talk about a lot in these types of shows is like, yeah, you're going to learn this stuff in a certain way when you're taking biology in 7th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, whatever. And a lot of the information you're going to learn in those classes is good, valuable information. But it's very, very often not the entire story. It's very, very often outdated-ish information. It's information that's not... When they're teaching you this stuff in, like I said, high school level and lower, like they're teaching you the information that is going to be practical for you as not a biologist, teaching you information in a way that's going to be practical for the lay person. Just every day, like, I don't particularly worry about biology more than the average person does. And So once you start getting into academia on it, once you start getting into college, and this is true across the board for any topic, basically, is you learn like basic groundworky stuff when you're in high school, when you're in middle school, and then a lot of that groundwork that you learn ends up getting kind of torn down when you get into college. A lot of the struggle I find with like early college students is that idea of like, okay, a lot of the stuff I learned in high school, I gotta twist that and turn that and reconceptualize that to make it work with what I'm learning now. So, any high schoolers out there who are looking to go into college, especially in the STEM fields, be ready for that. Be ready for your teacher to come out and say, yeah, what you learned is sort of true, but not really. And we got to relearn this now. And again, just be thinking about that as you're talking about anything in the real world, to be honest, that, hey, there's probably more information out here than what I have immediately available to me, just like locked in my noggin from when I was in high school 12 years ago. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Again, Headwaters Science Center is open 7 days a week. We're open Monday through Saturday from 9:30 to 5. We are open on Sundays from 1 to 5. If you happen to come by around 3:30, we'll probably be doing one of these shows. When I'm doing these kind of reacty ones, I'm usually tucked away in my office, so you won't see me out on the floor doing them. But a lot of the times, especially if you come like on a weekend, come on a Saturday or whatever, we'll be doing these as like a live demo, and we're always happy to have guests come by and watch us shoot them live and even participate as a volunteer or get an opportunity to like ask questions and all that. We're always happy to have a live audience for these types of things. Makes it easier to engage, to be honest. Yes, I love my internet audience, but there's a certain immediate gratification you get from having real people sitting in front of you that are reacting in real time that I really enjoy. And especially this time of year, we are very slow as far as like the foot traffic coming into the Science Center. So if you're somebody who, has been worrying about like, maybe I kind of want to go into the Science Center, but I'm worried about like being in close proximity to a bunch of people because COVID, or you're just trying to dodge crowds because you don't like being in crowds. I'm absolutely one of those people. Now's the time to do it, especially if like on a weekday, like swing through on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday afternoon, and you very well might be the only person here. Get a very heavily tailored experience. Get a lot of one-on-one time with the education staff if you come in on a weekday this time of year. So if that sounds appealing to you, absolutely come and stop by. We would love to see you. But otherwise, I'm going to sign off. Again, thank you guys for watching. And what's tomorrow? Tomorrow's Saturday, so it'll be me on the show again. And I honestly don't know what I'm going to do yet, but we'll figure it out.